Hey, Ken Hackathorn here, my buddy Bill Wilson. Another episode of the Gun Guys. One of the things that I think that sometimes we need to look back on is, for both of us, there's been specific individuals and sometimes events that have influenced us as far as our mentoring and how we got where we're at today as gun guys.
Yeah.
When you think back about, from the time you first got involved in guns and the direction your life has went, what are the events or the individuals? Are there some people that stand out or things that stand out to you as far as driving you the direction you went?
Well, there's kind of people that influenced me as far as my shooting career, and there's people that influenced me as far as the business career.
Yeah.
I mean, on the shooting side, there was this old gentleman who was a bullseye shooter. Was out the Berryville range one day, and I'm sure you can remember back when you were at that stage of your shooting career where you were good, but you weren't fully up to what your skill level was capable of,
Yeah.
and so you're inconsistent.
Yeah.
You go to the range and one day you'd shoot pretty darn good, and you go to the range another day and you shoot like crap, Well, I was out the range, the Berryville range, practicing by myself, and there was another guy down at the far end of the deal, the guy down there shooting bullseye, and I was having one of those shoot like crap days, and I was, at that point, I was just determined it was the gun, it was the ammo, it just, you know what I mean? You just can't be me,
Mm-hmm.
And the guy came over there, started visiting with me, small talk with me, and I started visiting with him and telling him how frustrated I was and all that kind of stuff. And had I think it was about a 10-inch steel gong out there, like 50 yards or something like that. And, I wasn't even trying to hit it that day because I was shooting so bad at 10 and 15 yards. And he said, "You mind if I shoot your pistol a little bit?" And he picks up the pistol there and one-handed out there, and he dumps a magazine and hits that thing every single time. And he said, "Well, Sonny, I don't really think there's anything wrong with the gun." And that was a real turning. Unfortunately, I don't remember the old man's name. That was a turning point because it was like, I just got to work at this harder. There's nothing wrong with my equipment. I just got to work at this whole thing harder. And me, I've always been kind of sensitive to having a good trigger pull on my guns. Unlike Larry Vickers, who can shoot the crappiest trigger in the world.
You can shoot a high point well.
Yeah, pretty well. And I think you're a little bit like I am, but we kind of like nice triggers on our guns.
Yeah.
Well, I was visiting with Bill Blankenship at the Second Chance, his motorhome at Second Chance one time, and he brought out the gun that he set all those national championships with, letting us play with it. I'm dry firing this gun, and I mean, it's got that absolute heavy, creepy, terrible trigger, And I'm like, "Bill, how in the world can you shoot a gun like this, And he's like, "You just got to apply the basics, young man. You just got to apply the basics." And so that was, those two people really helped me a lot as far as the shooting career, because they kind of like got me over humps, to get to the next level. And then as far as business is concerned, I mean, I can't say enough good about my dad instilling the business side to me, and my granddad instilling, doing your best, hard day's work for hard, for a day's pay, kind of the work. I kept to credit my granddad with the work ethic, and my dad with the the business angle stuff. And then after that, I mean, when I started getting into the gun building stuff, Armand, Swenson, and Jim Clark were so good to me. I mean, both those guys, every time I had a problem, I could get either one of them on the phone, and they take the time to talk with me and help me work through issues and stuff like that. And so they were very influential in the early days of Wilson Combat.
And back in the day, Armand, Swenson, and Jimmy Clark were powerhouses in the custom 1911 world. I mean, they were kind of gods.
When I started Wilson Combat, working on 1911s, my goal was to be something even remotely close to Swenson. I mean, he was the target there to be like.
Wow. Yeah.
How about you?
Well, I grew up, and people always ask me, how do you get into guns? And the answer is, I don't really know. I think at a certain age in life, some guys, young guys, are as even kids, you're into motorcycles or cars or planes or whatever. That's what you're, for whatever reason, guns always were of interest to me. And I remember where we lived. The fellow that was the neighbor, the older guy was my neighbor, a guy named Charlie Gillis. And he was a gun guy. And I can remember he would come home from the range and he had a big picnic table out in the backyard where that's where he would clean his guns. Well, I was a little kid, probably 6, 7 years old, I don't know. But I used to go over and watch. I didn't know much about it, but I knew that was some cool shit, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I was really interested. And really from that point on, and really the first time I ever fired a real gun, my dad and him were buddies. They worked at they were employed the same place. And both World War II vets, you know. Charlie was an old 82nd Airborne guy, tough as nails. You know, went on D-Day as a glider, made the jump across the Rhine. I mean, the guy was just, you know, again, both my dad and him were products of the Depression. But Charlie's the first. We went to the range. My dad went with, first time I shot a rifle was a Marlin 39, 22. Mm-hmm. The first time I fired a centerfire handgun was Charlie's Colt Single Action Army. I mean, so he had a lot of influence on me, and quite honestly, early on, a lot of my taste and interest in guns were as a result of Charlie. And my first handgun I ever bought, when I was 14 years old, I worked all summer mowing grass, scraping paint, now. I despise scraping and painting now. I wouldn't, I despise it. But I worked all summer and saved up $67.50, which is what it cost Charlie. I don't really had an FFR or not, I don't remember, but he bought for me from a place called the Pittsburgh Handgun Headquarters, a Smith & Wesson K22. And that was my first handgun. I still have it, by the way. Right. I've shot a gazillion rounds through it, but that launched me into not only my shooting career, but certainly my handgun career. So he was a big influence. I think, you know, my dad was never into guns. My dad didn't dislike guns. He just saw a gun as a tool, like a hammer or saw or whatever. If you didn't need it, he just didn't.
My dad was the same way. He collected guns, but he didn't shoot guns.
Yeah, and so that Charlie's the guy that kind of got me headed down the road where I was really thought guns were cool things. I had a shooting buddy, one of my high school neighborhood buddies, a guy named Mike Patterson, good dude, and his father had been a Marine in World War II, served in the Pacific, and he was a gun guy. And I remember he had a circle of friends, of his buddies. By the way, most of them were World War II vets, all into guns, and they would go periodically out to the strip mines. I live in southern Ohio, and the strip mines is kind of an area you go to shoot in, you know. And they'd go out, and these guys had 1911s. Back then, the cool guy gun was the .357 Magnum. So the cool guys had Smiths, or, you know, some guys had Ruger Blackhawks, but they all had a sporterized 03 Springfield, and they all had, when the M1 carbines came on, they all had those. We'd go out. Well, I just had a 22. Mike and I had 22 pistol, 22 rifles, but we watched those guys. And the reality was they were gunmen. And I remember watching them, listening to them, see what they were about. I was like, really, there's more to this than meets the eye. And like you, I was never a very structured shooter. I remember the first time I tried bullseye shooting, I was in the Army. I'm going to tell you what, that's hard shit. Mm-hmm. It is really hard. And I remember I quickly lost interest because it was so hard. The slow fire I could kind of get by on. The time fire, 5 shots, 20 seconds, it wasn't bad. When you got down to 5 shots in 10 seconds, the rapid fire, I might as well have thrown rocks at the target. And I just got discouraged and kind of went, this is stupid, I'm not going to do it anymore. So, and I will admit, we grew up in a generation of gun magazines. And I tell people, there were a number of them back then, everybody, American Rifleman. And American Rifleman was more of a technical journal back then. It was not, very flamboyant. It just reported the facts on guns and ammunition and stuff. The magazine that I read religiously as a kid was Guns and Ammo. I mean, I can remember sitting in study hall in high school reading the latest Guns and Ammo. And Charlie, my neighbor, Charlie Gillis, would give me his old issues. And honestly, Guns and Ammo magazine was probably a huge influence, and I read everything. Elmer Keith was one of my heroes, and of course, Jeff Cooper.
Yeah.
And so really people say, well, later in life, Cooper became a big influence because I went, I took one of his classes early on and ended up being one of his assistant instructors at Gun Sight. But the readings were what really got me funneled into it. And the truth is that Guns and Ammo magazine was a huge influence, because that's where we got our information back then. There wasn't any internet. And so along the way, I've met a lot of people who kind of allowed me to get more focused. And I think one thing about being a competition shooter, everybody we know, we're all somewhat type A personalities in the sense we're pretty competitive. And you know, that I tell people, it's not shooting well that's important, it's not getting discouraged, because periodically those steps along the way you hit a wall. And I think you got to kind of summon up something that says, I'm not going to accept this, I'm going to get better. And I always tell people, you know, I was never been a great shooter. You are, Bill. I mean, you've won a lot of major matches. You've been a really great shooter in your time. And I tell people, I've never been a great shooter. I struggle to be a good shooter, but I always enjoyed it.
Oh, yeah.
And, you know, there aren't many things in life that are important that you really be great at. And I struggle to be good at a couple things. And luckily for me, shooting was one of them. And you know, I got into the training business kind of by accident. I've been fairly successful at it. But I've met a lot of people along the way that have had an influence. Jim Cirillo, for example. Not so much when I was around him, but after years later, the stuff he came back with, the things he said, the things he showed me, things he described, I went, you know what?
Yeah.
That's like his comments about accuracy.
Yeah. He knew what he's talking about.
He knew what he was talking about. So I think that I'm like you. I've been privileged. In many ways, we lived in a time where we got to hang out with some real giants. And like you say, Bill Blankenship, very low-key guy, nicest guy in the world. I remember one time, I'm like you, at a Yankee Cup, we were inside of Ray's building there, and it was after the match, and we were having some adult beverage. And you were invited into those things. You just didn't wander in. You were invited to come and have a little bourbon. And Bill Blankenship pulls out his Colt 45 hardball gun that he won the Nationals with, and everybody's looking at it. And I'm like you, I checked it.
Safety still on?
What in the world is wrong with this gun? Well, I remember one of the comments somebody else made. I knew another guy that shot bullseye at like the national match circuit back in the day, and I remember his description of Bill Blankenship. He said, yeah, man, he can really hold hard. Well, what he meant is he had a heck of a grip, a vice lick, to the point where whether it was a good light trigger or heavy, it didn't matter. He gripped the gun so hard it didn't move. And it living proof he was a national champion many times over. So those are the lessons you kind of learn along the way. And, you know, I feel privileged that I knew some of those guys, and I got to hang out with them. And certainly I tried to absorb as much information as I could.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a little bit about how things worked out for us. And one of the reasons we're sitting here and talking is the Gun Guys.
Yeah.
Hope you enjoyed it. Stay tuned for another edition.